Okay, that's brilliant. Uh, oh, so sorry. I think I may have by mistake pressed record.
No,
I'll take.
I didn't mean to record it anyway. That's good. It's good.
Oh, fine. Okay, fine. All right, brilliant. Okay, so here's an outline of the kind of some of the themes I'll be speaking about. I'll have a quick sketch of the Crusades. Not too much about that because one could spend a long time going into depth about what the Crusades were and what happened. I want to just cover that quite quickly. I think some of the key questions that arise are the kind of relative importance of the Crusades, both politically, culturally, and even religiously in the Islamic world versus in the West. So I'll kind of touch on the differences in how the Crusades have been perceived over time. I'll say a bit about how popular perceptions have kind of given us a specific understanding of the Crusades, which does bear challenge or does require challenge, and then I will talk about some of the new research across languages and regions that's been done or has been done in the last few decades, which it kind of helps us to gain more clarity on kind of East-West relations, the relations between Muslims and Christians over time, which I think really sort of overturn the idea that the Crusades are a long-standing and kind of never-ending civilizational clash between Muslims and Christians. That really is a view that needs to be debunked, and I hope that this lecture will help us to do that. And then we'll end with the question of why the Crusades matter today, if indeed you think that they do matter, and that's a question we can consider together at the end of the lecture. Next slide, please. So the key questions I hope we can delve into a bit more are the Crusades a phenomenon primarily about warfare? To give you an insight into where we'll go with this point, what we find is that war is the kind of the opening salvo of the Crusades, insofar as it's an armed pilgrimage that begins on the premise of warfare, but it very quickly becomes something quite different, more about cross-cultural interaction, but also how Crusaders come to the Middle East and learn a great deal about how Middle Easterners live, and they form alliances, political alliances and military alliances with Muslim states very quickly. So we'll talk about that process when we get to that section. We'll think a bit about the ways in which in the Islamic world the Crusades were not really called the Crusades until the 19th century. They were not seen as a specific phenomenon, and we'll say a bit more about that, about why that was the case in due course. We'll say a bit about the religious differences that are seen to be at the heart of the Crusades, and we'll ask the question: were the Crusades really a clash between Christianity and Islam, or has the long-term consequence of the Crusades been the deeper division between Eastern and Western Christianity? And that, many would argue, is the longer-lasting legacy of the Crusades rather than a division or a history of antagonism between Christianity and Islam. So again, something for us to ponder. And towards the second half of the lecture, we will talk about Salah ad-Din and his role in reversing the tide of the Crusades, but the ways in which he's held up as a key figure. In many ways, that's justified, but we'll also look at other figures who played an equally important role, whose stories are not so widely told. And we'll say a bit about why Salah ad-Din became a useful person to focus on in Crusades historiography. So historiography being the writing of history. So that's kind of some of the key questions. I'll begin with a little discussion on how the Crusades have been written about over time. So we do have accounts of the Crusades from the era in which they took place. So kind of contemporary accounts of Crusades do exist. They're few and far between. Now, to give you a quick overview, when did the Crusades begin? I'm going to use Western dating, so you can map these dates to your kind of general understanding of history. I'm not going to use Islamic dating for the purposes of this lecture. So the Crusades begin from the point of view of Western history writing in 1095, when Pope Urban calls for a crusade, or he doesn't call it a crusade, but he calls for an armed pilgrimage to the Middle East to help liberate Christian pilgrims who are not being allowed to visit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and they're being stopped by Seljuk Muslims. So 1095 is considered to be the start of the Crusades from the Western point of view. The Western writing of the Crusades also regards 1291 as the ending of the Crusades, when the last Crusader kingdom falls. So those are the kind of dates: 1095 to 1291, around 200 years, 2 centuries of Crusader activity. Now, these wars or kind of encounters have been written about extensively since the very beginning of the Crusader period up to the present day, but there have been massive shifts in the ways in which they've been written about. So as I mentioned, there were medieval historians and even soldiers and participants in the Crusades who wrote narratives of the Crusades at the time. These were filtered into historical accounts that were produced in later centuries, and what we find is that the ways in which Western historians, writing in Latin predominantly, viewed the Crusades was extremely different from the ways in which Arabs and Muslims and Easterners in general viewed the Crusades. A key difference is that when Arab historians, for example, Ibn al-Qalanisi or Ibn al-Athir, Ibn al-Qalanisi wrote during the Crusades and soon after, and Ibn al-Athir wrote many decades afterwards, when they wrote about the Crusades, they did not use the term Crusades. They did not regard the Crusades as a distinct type of warfare. Rather, they saw the Crusaders as one enemy amongst many enemies, and their enemies included later on the Mongols, who at that point had not converted to Islam, and other Muslims. So from that point of view, what's interesting is that the Crusades are not seen as Crusades by Arabs and Muslims until much later in history, in the 19th century, when the Crusades become an important focal point for Arab historians, particularly Christian Arab historians, who are resisting Western colonialists, European colonialists in the Middle East. And they invoke the Crusades to say, look, the Europeans have always been interested in colonial activity. The Crusades are an example of that. And so in that moment, in that historical moment when Arabs are reviving ideas of Arab nationalism against European imperialism, the Crusades are resurrected as a focal point for Arab writers. A key intervention or kind of book written in the 20th century in 1983 was Amin Malouf's The Crusades Through Arab Eyes. And this book really brought the story of the Crusades to the modern Arabic reading public, particularly those who read English, because it was written in English. And the idea of this book was to select passages of ancient Arabic writings on the Crusades to show, firstly, how brutal the Crusades were, how immoral the Christian Crusaders were, and how heroic Salah ad-Din was. Now, this book needs to be placed in its historical context. It served a purpose at the time. It was a piece of, you could call it propaganda. It was important for sharing some of the Arabic materials on the Crusades from way back to new audiences, but it also presented a relatively distorted picture of the Crusades, one which recent studies have shown to be not rooted in a wider basis of evidence. The wider evidence shows that as soon as the Middle Easterners arrived in, as soon as the Crusaders arrived in the Middle East, they although their arrival was violent, they quickly began to buy and sell and carry out trade with Middle Easterners, whether Muslims, Jews, or Christians, because of course Christians were already present in the Middle East. The Eastern Christian churches were well established, and they began to adopt Muslim ways of life, or let's say Middle Eastern ways of life, and they also began to learn Arabic and acculturated themselves to the kind of conditions of the Middle East. So in that sense, the idea of the Crusades being a series of military expeditions, and that being their main significance, is not supported by so much evidence that comes from both Westerners and Easterners who wrote about the Crusades from earliest times. So Amin Malouf's book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, is a kind of significant kind of gives a significant snapshot of how the Crusades were thought about even in the late 20th century. And since then, there's been quite a lot of work done to kind of, let's say, kind of put this book into its context and present more far-reaching evidence of interaction between Muslims and Christians during the Crusades era. Next slide, please. This is a kind of a list or kind of snapshot of some of the important works that's been done, important work that's been done in the English language, covering Crusades history. Some books that I show pictures of here are academic books, insofar as they look at documents and narratives written at the time by Latin observers of the Crusades, who may have been living in Crusader cities in the Middle East, and they also show the Muslim perspectives on the Crusades. Now, what's been interesting is that for many decades, if not centuries, the Crusades were understood largely from the point of view of how Latin chroniclers or kind of historians and scholars through the ages presented the Crusades. But in recent decades, there's been a real shift and a real attempt in the Western academic sphere to try to understand Muslim perspectives on the Crusades, but also Middle Eastern perspectives more generally. So the views of Muslims, the views of Eastern Christians, the views of Byzantines, the views of Armenians, and other participants in Crusades activity. That's led to many important works. One important work is Carol Hillenbrand's The Crusades, Islamic Perspectives, which is a very readable book, very popular, and it's done a lot to reshape our thinking about the Crusades by presenting Islamic points of view. One key intervention or kind of a book has been this book by Michael Kohler. Michael Kohler has collected a series of documents, treaties signed between Crusader states and Muslim states in the crusading era. And these documents show that there was a huge amount of cooperation between various Crusader states and Muslim states. And sometimes Muslim states would enter into a treaty with a Crusader state against another Muslim state. And by the same token, the Crusader state might join forces or sign a treaty with the Muslim state against another rival Crusader state. So that shows that there was sort of a shifting landscape of alliances and treaties between different states in the Middle East during the era of the Crusades. This has been really important in helping us to understand that the Crusades were not just about warfare. Treaties, alliances, commerce, diplomacy, even intermarriage were an essential part of the Crusade story. And that's something we'll cover more towards the end of the lecture. One of the historians I've worked on, Ibn al-Farad, who was writing in 15th century Egypt, 14th century and 15th century Egypt, he also produces many documents. And again, these documents show the extent to which Muslims and Crusaders often use the same language of diplomacy, of respect, of guaranteeing each other's religious freedoms, and showing a certain level of understanding and empathy with each other, which goes against the idea that these were kind of times of unending warfare and civilizational conflict. Yeah, so next slide, please. So to kind of dial us back, sort of towards the kind of the sort of the beginning, what is the word crusade and what does it mean? So the word crusade means to mark with a cross, and what's interesting is that it's a word that was never used in the Arabic speaking world until the 19th century. When the Arab historians wrote about crusades, they would speak of Western Christians, called the Ifranj or Franks, whom they would contrast with Eastern Christians or the Rum or Byzantines, with whom they'd had interaction over many centuries, because of course the Eastern Christians were present in the Middle East even before the advent of Islam. So in that sense, they were, as even more kind of, let's say, indigenous to the Middle East than Muslims were. So Muslim writers were extremely aware that the Ifranj or the Crusaders were outsiders, unlike the Byzantine Christians who were insiders to the Middle East. The terminology of the Crusades, or in Arabic, Hurub al-Salibiyya, or the Wars of the Cross, that came into being only in the 19th century, when the idea of the Crusades was revived in the context of Arab nationalism, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The way in which the Crusades as a period of history is framed also differs greatly from east to west. In Western historiography, the number of Crusades is often numbered 8 or 9 main campaigns, and this time frame I mentioned before of 1095 to 1291 or 200 years is often invoked. In the Islamic world, these framings don't hold much meaning or much value. In fact, they don't really exist. For Muslims, the Crusades were one in a long line of Christian campaigning to take power and resources and territory away from Muslims. I'll say more about that in a minute. And they certainly did not give them a number or this kind of framing. So how have Muslims told the story over time? Interestingly, Muslims tell the story through a mix of fascination, horror, trauma, but also accepting that the Crusaders came and went and that they did not leave a lasting impression on Muslim history and historiography. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean by that the impact of the Crusades was much greater on the Western imagination than on the Muslim imagination. This is because for the Crusaders, they spent many multiple billions of pounds, or the equivalent of billions of pounds, on the Crusades. They lost 2 million people. They had a 200-year presence in the Middle East, but in the end, they had to bring their people back to the West, and the Crusades failed in that sense. And there was a lot of soul searching in Western historiography around about why the Crusades happened. Were they wise? Were they pious, or were they impious? Were they worldly? Were they spiritual? Were they justified? Were they not justified? In the Muslim world, the Crusades were seen as yes, a trauma, an incursion, but no different or no worse than the Mongol incursion. And because Muslims eventually held their own against the Crusaders over time, they did not consider it to be a reason for as much soul searching as was the case on the Christian side. When you read stories of the Crusades in Arabic historiography, the Crusaders appear, often the stories are very vivid, but they often appear as no more threatening than a Muslim enemy or a kind of any other kind of enemy. The situation in the Islamic world when the Crusades first took place was one of disunity. The Fatimids, who are Ismaili Shi'is, held sway in North Africa and Egypt, and the Zengids and Seljuks held sway in the Eastern Islamic world, and they held the major cities of Damascus and Aleppo and Jerusalem and the Hijaz. So the Muslim world itself was disunited. When the Crusaders came, and I'll say, I'll expand on this when we get into the Crusade story in a minute, the fact that the Muslims were not united at the point of the start of the Crusades is important, because it means that the Crusades came about at a time when Muslims could not easily or quickly coordinate a united response. And so part of the trauma of how Muslims have regarded the Crusades was around the fact that the Muslims were not initially able to repel the Crusaders as successfully as they would have wished to do so. So that's part of how Muslims have told the story of a shock, but not the biggest shock. Arguably, the biggest shock came from the Mongols, who were much more destructive of kind of Muslim cities and their institutions than the Crusaders were ever able to be. Muslims did not even recognize the Crusades as a specific phenomenon called the Crusades until, as I said, the kind of, around sort of less than 200 years ago. So that's a bit about the framing of the idea of the Crusades. Can we have the next slide, please? Here is an image. It's from the Ottoman era, and it's a miniature showing Turkish soldiers battling the Knights of St. John in the siege of Rhodes in the Mediterranean in 1522. And the reason why I've shown this image is because it shows that for Muslims, the Crusades went on well after the Western Crusader states fell in supposedly in 1291. So for Muslims, the Crusades didn't really end when the last Crusader kingdom fell. Rather, when the Muslims had a definitive victory against the Byzantines in 1453 in Constantinople, that was considered kind of sealing the fate of Western Christians in the Middle East. That was an important point, but they also regarded the kind of Crusader threat as continuing well into the Ottoman era. So the kind of time boundaries of the Crusades are seen very, very differently by the two sides. Next slide, please. So what were the reasons why the Crusades took place? So a bit of background. In the world of Christianity, some of you may know that in 1054, the Christian world was ruptured into two main kind of sides. One was the Pope in representing Western Christianity, and then you had the Eastern Orthodox churches. And this division occurred, called the Great Schism. It occurred because of a dispute around the Pope's authority. Was the Pope for all of Christendom across East and West? The Eastern Christians did not accept his authority, and therefore the kind of worldwide Christianity divided along these two lines. So this Great Schism and the division of Christianity into two main branches or groups of branches was greatly damaging to the Christian world. And the Pope from then onwards, or a series of popes, were concerned with how to bring the Christian world back together. So that was in 1054. While that was happening, in the meantime, the Muslim Seljuks had defeated Eastern Christians, or the Byzantines, at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. And this was a real blow to Byzantine or Eastern Christianity. From then on, the Byzantines were concerned with how they could recover their prestige and their territory and their standing in the Middle East. And they also complained that Christian pilgrims who wanted to visit Jerusalem, which was the home of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the last resting place of Prophet Isa, or Jesus Christ as they saw it, they wanted support for their pilgrims to be able to continue visiting the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And they complained that the Seljuks prevented Christians from doing so. So that's going on in the background. Jerusalem had been, since 638, when the Muslims conquered it, a city in which religious freedom was permitted to all religious groups. Freedom of worship was guaranteed by the Pact of Umar of 638, and the idea was that this was a city sacred to three traditions, the three Abrahamic traditions, and no political ruler or political development would prevent the worship of these three communities at this sacred space. And that had worked reasonably well. This kind of this sort of shared idea of sacredness and tolerance between the three faiths. So when the Byzantines complained the Seljuks prevented their pilgrims from reaching Jerusalem, this was something that shook the idea of Jerusalem being a place of a place available to people of all three traditions. In the Christian world, there were also many kind of campaigns in which Christians had been taking power from Muslims, even away from kind of central Islamic lands. So, for example, Islamic Spain had seen in reconquista attempts or attempts to reconquer Muslim territory by Christians. Toledo fell to Muslims in the 11th century, and the Normans also recaptured Sicily from Muslims around the same time. So already before the Crusades are called, Christians are on the rise, Europeans are on the rise, and their primary target is Muslim territory. So that's kind of a bit about the background. Next slide, please. So against the background of the Great Schism, and the fact that pilgrims are being disrupted according to the Byzantines, and Christianity being on the rise anyway, the Pope in France, he ends up in France when he calls a crusade, but he receives word from Alexius Comnenus, the Eastern Christian leader saying, please, can you help us? We are not allowed to practice Christianity freely. The Muslims have been oppressing us, and we need you to come and help us out. The Byzantine emperor does not call for a crusade. He does not ask for a military campaign. He asks for specific kinds of help. But the Pope sees here an opportunity. He sees an opportunity to, first of all, try to bring all of Christianity under his control. He sees an opportunity to recapture Jerusalem from Muslims. Even though Christians have been allowed to practice Christianity freely in Jerusalem for many centuries, he wants to take the initiative to recapture the region on behalf of Christians. And he also wants to deflect attention from the fact that there is a great deal of instability and fragmentation of kind of societies and states within the Western world through the breakup of the feudal system. So he sees here a golden opportunity to do something different, to bring a campaign about that will allow Western Christians to regain the initiative in more ways than one. So he calls for an armed pilgrimage. He doesn't call it a crusade initially, that word didn't exist until some time later, but he does call for an armed pilgrimage. He asks for all of the kings and leaders of Western states who are Christian to gather their best men to go on a joint armed campaign to the Middle East. And the purposes are twofold. Firstly, to recapture and regain territory for Christianity, and secondly, to make a sacred pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So the aims are both worldly and spiritual. He promises that anybody who goes on a pilgrimage will have their sins forgiven, and he promises that anybody who goes on a crusade will receive money for their families who are left behind. So in other words, he incentivizes the idea of a crusade very, very strongly. The response to the call is unprecedented. There's a huge amount of interest in going on this armed pilgrimage. Although he could not have known what the response would be. In fact, many people sign up. Now, the problem is that many of the people who sign up to go on the crusade are not trained soldiers. They're led by trained soldiers, knights, and so on. Many of those who come are opportunists and people who want to find a way to can better themselves, to gain wealth, and so on and so forth. It's a route to upward mobility. Now, what is there to be gained by going on a crusade, on an armed pilgrimage, when you could be giving up your life, you could be giving up, you could end up, kind of never going back to your family? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that at this point in time, Muslim and European cities are in different states of development. On the one hand, Muslim cities are very large. They will have, maybe hundreds of thousands of citizens. They're often very multilingual. They're centers of learning. European capitals at this point in time are much smaller, and their levels of development are much less pronounced. This is kind of acknowledged across, historiography in both, across languages. This is widely known that at this point in time, Muslims are much more developed in their understanding of the world, in their kind of in their technology and in their wealth than European states. So there's great benefits for the Crusaders in going to the Middle East, being able to kind of carry out warfare, but also plunder, because a large part of warfare is plunder. That you go to a place, if you conquer it successfully, you can carry off the booty. So wherever you see, if you enter someone's home, you can take. If you beat them and you defeat them, you can take whatever you see, and that becomes your property. The idea was that the plunder would be given back to the Pope and even to Eastern Christians to help them, but that never happened. So I'll say more about that in a minute. But basically, the idea of the Crusades was a route to upward mobility, but also a way to get wealthy for a lot of the Crusaders. That's not to say that they didn't have a sincere religious motive. Many would also have seen in this an opportunity to carry out a sincere act of pilgrimage. So the kind of motives would have been mixed, but there's absolutely no doubt that the kind of worldly motive or the material motive was a strong part of why the call to the Crusades met with such a successful response. Next slide, please. So here we have a map depicting some of the routes of the Crusaders. So the first crusade took place soon after it was called in 1095, and this was an overland route, and it went across, so from sort of France, and of course, people gathered from many places on this first crusade, across Eastern Europe, through Constantinople or modern-day Istanbul, uh, down into the Holy Land. What's interesting about this route is that it was a route in which Western Christians or Crusaders would encounter many Eastern Christians along the way, and also Jewish communities and people of other religious minorities. But when they went on their campaign, because they were an untrained rabble, I mean, I'm using the word rabble in a slightly snooty way. I don't mean to be snooty. I'm just saying that's how they're depicted in the sources. When these crusaders went on these campaigns, and they were often untrained soldiers, as I said, they did not distinguish between Jews, Eastern Christians, Muslims, or people of other faiths. They were basically trying to fight with and defeat anyone they met. This meant that as they traveled through Eastern Europe, through Anatolia, into the Holy Land, they made a lot of enemies, and their reputation preceded them. It became clear that the Crusades were not being carried out according to principles of warfare that were widely acknowledged in the Middle East and across the world at the time. Women were not spared, booty was not given to Crusades leaders in the appropriate way, and prisoners of war were not treated fairly, were not treated with justice or compassion, and the Crusaders behaved very, very badly. What was really painful for kind of the Christian perspective on the Crusades is that Western Christians murdered Eastern Christians with impunity. They were not stopped from killing Eastern Christians, particularly by their rulers or their crusade leaders, and they caused a lot of bad blood and bad feeling during the course of this first crusade. This culminated in their arrival in the Holy Land, in which they took the city by surprise, a sort of city-state by surprise, and they carried out a massacre. And that massacre involved the Crusaders killing Eastern Christians, Jews, and Muslims without discrimination. Many tens of thousands of people lost their lives. Now, you might ask yourselves, why would they kill Eastern Christians? The reason why they killed Eastern Christians is because for Western Christians, Eastern Christians were as much foreign, they were as foreign, as other, and as different from themselves as Muslims were. They did not speak their language, they worshipped in different ways, and they did not recognize the authority of the Pope. And that was a key point for them. Them not recognizing the authority of the Pope meant that in some sense they saw them as infidels. They killed Jews because they again saw them as infidels. Jews were rounded up into synagogues, and synagogues were set on fire. Muslims were not allowed to flee, they were massacred as well. So the First Crusade did result in the Crusaders recapturing Jerusalem through quite bloody means, but it also meant that the Crusaders were seen as extremely dangerous, as people who had no principles, and as people who would kill even fellow Christians. So that kind of, this first campaign set the tone for how the Crusaders were then viewed by those of the Middle East in the decades that came later. Next slide, please. So I've described to you the kind of what happened in the First Crusade. The First Crusade was a victory for the Crusaders, but at the cost of their reputation and at the cost of the lives of many Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians. Then, at that point in time, because Muslims were taken by surprise and the Muslim world was not united, the Christians were able to establish themselves in Jerusalem and also in nearby cities and regions, to the point where they were able to establish 4 Crusader states. These Crusader states did have some longevity, and they kind of persisted into kind of the 1200s, but at the same time, the Muslims needed to get their act together and find a way to counter the Crusades. A number of campaigns took place. I've mentioned that in Western historiography, about 9 Crusades are kind of considered the main ones. In terms of the Muslim response, to give you a kind of brief outline, what happened was that it was quite hard for Muslims to have a unified response, and it happened in a piecemeal fashion. I mentioned before that the Fatimid Ismaili Shi'is and the Zengid Sunnis were at loggerheads with each other. One of the Zengid rulers was Imad ad-Din az-Zengi, and Imad ad-Din Zengi was a military commander who had a great deal of kind of bravery. And in 1144, he took one of the Crusader kingdoms down in Edessa or Ruha. And in doing so, he showed the Crusaders what Muslims were capable of militarily. This was a real setback for the Crusaders because up to this point, they had not been challenged very effectively by anyone in the Middle East. So 1144 is when this Crusader state falls to Muslims. And what's interesting is that Imad ad-Din Zengi calls this a jihad. This is very important for rallying Muslim unity around counter-crusading. This begins a process of turning the tide of the Crusades to recapture Edessa from Imad ad-Din Zengi. The Crusaders call for another crusade, but that crusade fails because by this point the Muslims are on the offensive. They are not just fighting defensively to protect what they have, but to regain what they've lost to the Crusaders. The idea of jihad is very interesting at this point because we consider jihad now to have, the popular Muslim understanding is that you have the greater jihad, the jihad against the nafs, then you have the lesser jihad, which is the military jihad, and these were ideas that were worked out over a period of time. Through the ulama kind of worked on these ideas in response to various kinds of events, and the Crusades were an important event in which shaped our understanding of jihad, or kind of a scholarly understanding of jihad, which then were percolated into the Muslim amongst the Muslim masses. So that without the Crusades, the kind of idea of jihad, might not have taken the shape that it did. But nevertheless, jihad was an important rallying call to bring Muslims together. What was interesting is that once the idea of jihad was established and Muslims were able to kind of counter-attack against the Crusaders, this was important for turning the tide. But while all this was happening, there was nonetheless another whole dimension to Muslim-Christian interaction, and that's the dimension of diplomacy. Because, as I said before, Muslims and Christians had to learn to live with each other, because these Crusader states that were in the Middle East for some decades were fairly stable for best part of 200 years, and a state of constant warfare was in no one's interest. So on the one hand, you have Muslims retaking the initiative. On the other hand, you also have war as only one side. The other side is diplomacy, trade, interaction. To the extent that the Crusades also provided opportunities for the translation of Middle Eastern texts into Latin, and that was an important way in which Middle Eastern learning travels to the Western world. Texts like Ptolemy's book on the Cosmos that came to the West through a Crusades era translation movement centered in Antioch or Antakya. So in other words, kind of cultural exchange was an important dimension of the Crusades. It wasn't just about warfare. There are even stories early on in the Crusades of Christians, Western Christians and Muslims marrying each other. As you can imagine, Muslim men, might be expected to marry Christian women, but because from a Sharia point of view, at least in the Sunni tradition, that's sort of allowed. But there were even stories of Muslim women being married to Christians, which of course goes against Sharia norms. And there are Christian sources which speak against these practices, saying that Christians must resist the idea of marrying with the local population. This begs the question: were there women involved in the Crusades? Well, there were women involved in the Crusades. What was interesting on the Western side is that women, noble Christian women, sometimes, rarely, but noticeably led Crusades and became queens in the Crusader states that were established in the Middle East. There's also another story of the Crusades, of gender in the Crusades, which is that Crusaders often brought women along with them in order to carry out domestic duties, to care for the wounded, to cook for the Crusaders, to tend to their needs, but also, as a form of prostitution. And we know this from the work done by Gary Lizer. And Middle Eastern historians who saw this phenomenon were quite shocked by it. They kind of hadn't quite seen anything like this before, so they remarked on this phenomenon of women traveling with Crusaders to the Middle East. Muslim women were much less involved in the Crusades, and from that, and so that their stories don't really come through in the same kind of way. So the contacts and interactions between Muslims and Crusaders were more complex than the idea of simply of warfare. In fact, some historians now would go so far as to say that if we want to read the Crusades correctly, we should see the Crusade states, the 4 states that were established, not really as outposts of the West in the Middle East, but rather a story of how the Bilad al-Sham, or the regions of Greater Syria in the Middle East, were so diverse in the medieval period that Christian states came and went, and kind of states rose and fell in a very interesting way, in a way that goes against the idea that this was a campaign which reshaped the Middle East. Rather, the Middle East shaped the Crusader states in key ways. So historians now see the Crusades phenomenon as one episode in a longer history of the development of Greater Syria. So that kind of diminishes the idea of the Crusades as being this world-changing set of events, particularly from the Islamic or Middle Eastern point of view. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn now to the story of, or the role of Saladin. He was a key figure. I mentioned before Ahmad ad-Din Zengi and his retaking of Edessa in 1144, and the fact that a crusade followed this, which was unsuccessful. So Salah ad-Din, some of you may know his story, and if not, I'll give you a brief account. He was a Kurdish general, and he grew up in a military family sponsored by the Zengid family, and he found himself called to Egypt when he was a young man, and he became eventually a Sunni vizier to the Ismaili dynasty of the Fatimids. He was a very skillful politician, and through various means he managed to put an end to the Fatimid dynasty in 1171. Not through bloodshed. There was, some bloodshed in Egypt at the time. The Fatimids were based in Egypt, in Cairo. There was bloodshed because the Fatimids were engaged in warfare both with their Sunni Zengid counterparts, but also with Crusaders. But Salah ad-Din very skillfully put an end to the Fatimid dynasty by separating all the men in the Fatimid dynasty from the women, so they could not produce children. And he re-established Sunni rule in Egypt under the banner of the Ayyubids. That's his own family surname. And he did this over the course of a few years. And so, in one sense, a key part of his kind of work in reversing the Crusades was in his bringing Egypt back into the so-called fold of Sunni Islam, which paved the way for him to build a unified Muslim response to the Crusaders. Initially, he was anxious to pursue unity amongst Muslims without worrying too much about the Crusaders. In other words, he didn't let his energy be sucked in by Crusades activity. Rather, he focused on achieving Muslim unity, which was a wise strategy. His treaties with the Crusaders kind of were devised over a number of years, in about 12 years, in which period he kind of worked on Muslim unity. The Crusaders, though, broke a treaty. Reynaud of Chatillon, he broke a treaty he'd made with Salah ad-Din. The treaty was about not Muslims and Christians not attacking each other's trading caravans. And Reynaud of Chatillon, his men attacked a Muslim caravan. So Salah ad-Din was angered by this, and he called for a jihad against Reynaud. And so this was the start of a series of battles with the Christians. A key battle was the Battle of Hattin in 1187. In this battle, Salah ad-Din and his men, they led Christians to through a narrow passageway through some very hostile territory, so hostile terrain, to a plain, kind of a period of a piece of land where there was no access to water, and the Muslims surrounded the Christians, and the Christians were weakened by lack of access to water, and they were defeated. And this was really significant because it paved the way for Salah ad-Din to then recapture Jerusalem from the Christians later that year. So this is 1187. Bear in mind that the Christians had taken Jerusalem in 1095. So we're talking, almost a century, a few years short of a century, that Jerusalem has been in Christian hands. And if you remember, that had been a massacre. Salah ad-Din does not carry out a massacre in Jerusalem. He gives all of the civilians safe passage, and he even allows Western Christian soldiers peaceful passage out of Jerusalem. But he makes an exception against two battalions, the Templars and the Hospitallers, because these are two types of Christian knights whose purpose is to kill Muslims. So he says that apart from the Knights Hospitallers and the Knights Templars, everyone is free to either stay in Jerusalem and live peacefully or to leave Jerusalem peacefully as well. For doing this act of kind of peaceful handover of power, Jerusalem gained the admiration of not just Muslims, but also people more widely. The Crusaders were sort of shocked by this behavior, and he quickly becomes an object of admiration by Latin writers who early in the Crusades period, soon after the Battle of Hattin and the recapture of Jerusalem by Muslims, begin to say that Salah ad-Din embodies the values of a Christian knight more than Christians do themselves. So he enters the kind of imagination of both Muslims and Crusaders as someone who has really exemplary qualities. He has these very generous terms of peace, and he restores Jerusalem to Muslim hands. The Western Christians in the West are very troubled by this. Even though they admire Salah ad-Din's behavior, they want to regain Jerusalem, so they send a group of kings on another crusade, the Third Crusade. These are German, British, and French kings. Now, in the event, Richard the Lionheart is the one who ends up in the Middle East trying to negotiate with Salah ad-Din. The Germans return to Germany, and the French don't listen to the British, and it's a story of internal warfare amongst Christians. But the upshot of all of this is that Richard the Lionheart enters into a period of trying to negotiate with Salah ad-Din. What is he negotiating for? He's negotiating for the return of Jerusalem and other territories to the Christians, those territories that have been taken by Salah ad-Din and the Muslim forces. Now, the kind of relationship between these two men is a very interesting one. It's been kind of written about a lot, and you even see it depicted in various films and so on. And it's interesting because the two men are sort of well matched. They both have a certain respect for each other. At the same time, Richard comes across as much less noble because he actually massacres 2,700 prisoners of war who are in his custody. and so he gains a reputation for being bloodthirsty and for being unwise. Salah ad-Din doesn't do any kind of activity, doesn't do anything like this. He's much more principled in the way he carries out warfare. This is acknowledged by Christian sources as well. At one point in their negotiations, Richard suggests that his sister Joanne marry Salah ad-Din's brother, but of course the sister doesn't want this, and Salah ad-Din's brother rejects the idea. But this is how close their negotiations got. But the upshot of these negotiations is that there's a mixture of minor warfare and negotiation and diplomacy. But the upshot is that the Christians do not regain Jerusalem from the Muslims. But Salah ad-Din is held up on both sides as a noble person, and he enters the imagination of Christians as a noble heathen, someone who doesn't believe in God but still has noble qualities, and he enters the Muslim imagination as someone who helps to turn the tide of the Crusades, and he becomes very important in that role later on. What's left out of the story is that the definitive fight against the Crusaders happens many decades later, in the kind of maybe almost a century later, at the hands of Baybars, a Mamluk emir, and Mamluk general. He's the Mamluk Sultan who reunites the Islamic world. And Baybars, I'm not going to go into his story today because there's not enough time, and I want to leave time for Q&A. Baybars is the person who repels the Mongols on the one hand, coming from the east, and he repels the Crusaders, and he brings down the last Crusader kingdom in 1291. So in many ways, well, his successors do, but he paves the way for that. In many ways, the key figure in bringing down the Crusader states of the Middle East is Baybars. But Salah ad-Din is held up as a person who was really pivotal, and whether or not he's the pivotal figure is something we can discuss as time goes on, as the lecture goes on. Next slide, please. So, why does Salah ad-Din gain so much interest? He gains so much interest because he has at his disposal a series of biographers who tell his life story even as it is happening. He has two historians, Imad ad-Din Isfahani and Bahauddin ibn Shaddad, who tell us many, many details about his life. And he also has a courtier, or kind of a chancellor, called Ibn al-Qalanisi, who collects all of Salah ad-Din's letters, documents, treaties, correspondences, diplomatic deeds, and he collects them, and he produces a book about them called Al-Mutajaddidat. So we have a lot of documentary evidence about how Salah ad-Din lived, and that helps to kind of bolster his reputation as a counter-crusader. Here we have an image of Salah ad-Din supposedly produced during his lifetime. What's really interesting about Salah ad-Din is that he wasn't a very worldly person. He had very little wealth himself. And as I mentioned before, he treated prisoners of war with great respect, and he was not a bloodthirsty person. And so many of the qualities for which he's remembered are very genuine. We see in him qualities which kind of conform with what ulama considered to be the ideal just ruler, someone who was an exemplar as a ruler. So what I'm about to say next is not to detract from any of those qualities, but he did become a figure who was as much mythical as real. So next slide, please. In the Western imagination, he became a kind of towering figure of the Crusades. Here is a portrait of Salah ad-Din produced in the 16th century, and there were many depictions of Salah ad-Din kind of in the early modern period, both in art, in poetry, and in stories. And even Dante, the Christian author of the Divine Commedia, he considered Salah ad-Din to be someone who occupied the lowest rung of heaven rather than in hell. He placed all Muslims in hell, but he considered Salah ad-Din to be good enough to enter the lowest rung of heaven. Now, why was this? First of all, this was because Salah ad-Din, as I said, had behaved extremely honorably during the course of his military campaigns with the Crusaders, but also because Salah ad-Din benefited from having his own propaganda machine in the form of biographers and so on. So he had these two things that were in his favor. Next slide, please. Salah ad-Din's reputation continued to remain strong over the centuries, to the point that Saddam Hussein considered himself to be a successor of Salah ad-Din, because he had the same birthplace of Tikrit in Iraq, and statues of Salah ad-Din went up in various parts of the Muslim world in the era of Arab nationalism. So here is a really famous statue of Salah ad-Din in Damascus, and you see in this image Salah ad-Din being flanked by two crusaders who've been defeated. So it's kind of a triumphalist statue, and the crown of Jerusalem kind of is behind him on the floor, gathering dust. The idea being that Salah ad-Din defeated the Crusaders to regain Jerusalem, which is all very true. At the same time, there is an element of hero worship that has gone on with the depictions of Salah ad-Din, which I would say kind of perpetuate the idea that Muslims and Christians have had these centuries of struggle with each other, which I would argue is not really the true story of the Crusades. The true story of the Crusades is a story of interaction, a story of mutual learning. Admittedly, the learning was more of Christians learning from Muslims, because Muslims were more developed at this time. But nevertheless, the idea of perpetual warfare, of deep conflict, is something which I think could be usefully challenged. Next slide, please. So, looking at the Crusades in the long view, the Crusades are kind of an episode of history, or a phenomenon of history, that's been exploited for various reasons, represented, misrepresented, remembered, but always kind of given a sort of a mythical overlay. And recent research shows that it's more a story of interaction than of conflict, or as much of one as the other. What have been the consequences of the Crusades? The Crusades themselves ended within 200 years, or around 200 years, but their effects on people's imaginations or their understanding of East-West relations has been profound, particularly since the 19th century, when the Crusades have been resurrected as a kind of an era of immense importance. The Crusaders were never as threatening to the Islamic world as the Mongols, but the Crusaders have been held up as a worse enemy. And part of that is because the Mongols eventually converted to Islam. They apologized for the behavior of their forefathers. Christians did not, hold such themselves to account in the same way. The effect of the Crusades on Christian-Muslim relations has been detrimental, but at the same time, it's important to remember that Christians and Muslims were not at war for all of the centuries. If anything, Christians and Muslims in the Middle East learned to live together, and the Crusades cemented the division between Eastern and Western Christianity more than cementing a division between Christians and Muslims. In fact, Muslims early on made a distinction between Eastern Christians, Byzantines, Armenians, and others, whom they regarded as almost their cousins because they shared a similar culture, versus Christians from the West, who were seen as undeveloped, as ignorant, as backward, as unprincipled. So Muslims always had a more nuanced approach to Christians, or nuanced understanding of Christians overall, and they were much more in favor of alliances and kind of contact with Eastern Christians than with Western Christians, who were kind of particularly those who are not kind of acculturated to the ways of the Middle East. In the longer picture, the kind of relations between Christians and Muslims kind of eased greatly after the Crusades. If anything, the Byzantines and the Muslims, after the kind of fall of Constantinople in 1453, they had to learn to live together in peaceful ways. So in that sense, the Crusades were not the key factor in Christian-Muslim relations in the way that they may be seen to be nowadays. Next slide, please. I'm going to end with a couple of quotations of writers on the Crusades to kind of show the kind of the ways in which the Crusades have been viewed in interesting ways over the centuries. Edward Gibbon was an 18th century historian of the Roman Empire, and he said about the Crusades that the Crusades were an expression of Christian fanaticism, and that, I'm not going to read the whole quotation to you, but his basic point is that the Crusades did not reflect well on Christians, and had Western Christians rather used that time, the energy, the resource to reflect on themselves and to better themselves, they would have done much more to improve their own salvation or prospects for salvation, and they would have done much more to improve the lives of Christians than going on this ill thought out and foolish campaign in the Middle East. So he is not a fan of the Crusades. Next slide, please. I'm going to end with a story from Osama ibn Munqidh, a Syrian nobleman who had lots of interaction with the Crusaders, and he lived through the Crusades, and he tells many interesting stories, first of all, of how barbaric and crude the Crusaders are and how he's not impressed with them. But he also had friends who were Crusaders, including friends who were Templars, the kind of let's say kind of rabidly anti-Islamic kind of section of the Crusader community. And he tells a story. Again, I won't read the whole thing, but he said that he was praying in Al-Aqsa Mosque at one point, and at this point, Jerusalem was in Christian hands, and a Christian who's come recently from the West tries to turn his prayer direction towards the East, and he's reprimanded by a fellow Templar, and the fellow Templar apologizes to Osama and said, my fellow countryman is ignorant, he's just arrived, he doesn't know the ways of the Middle East, and that's why he's trying to change your direction of prayer. And this exemplifies the fact that over time, Western Christians learned a lot about Islam, they learned a lot about Middle Eastern ways, Muslim languages, cultures, ways of living, and in that sense, they were enriched by the Crusades. And this, I think, underlines the point that the Crusades, as well as being an episode of warfare, they were also a learning opportunity for Christians about the Islamic world. Thank you. I'll end it there. I hope that's been useful to you. Inshallah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fozia, the brilliant presentation and so much a wealth of information. Really much appreciated. I'll kind of open the floor for anyone that'd like to ask any questions. We have actually Professor Hugh Goddard, who's the professor of Islamic history and Christian Muslim relations at Edinburgh University in the audience. But is there anything anyone would like to ask on anything that's been discussed? I can start off if you want. Yeah.
Could I ask what was actually written or said at the time when the main church in Constantinople was changed from a church to a mosque?
Could you hear that?
Could you repeat the question for me? I only heard part of it. I'm so sorry.
The question is, what was written or said at the time when the main church in Constantinople was changed from a church to a mosque?
Thank you for the question. I'm afraid I don't know particularly what the British response was, but to put it into context, when the Western Christians left the Middle East, the kind of longer consequence of this, in the longer view, was that the kind of great schism that I mentioned from 1054 was never healed. So in that sense, Eastern and Western Christians were not on the same side. So I'm not sure there was a British response that was noteworthy. I mean, I may be wrong because I haven't looked deeply into this, but at this point in time, you have Muslims, Eastern Christians, and Western Christians not all on the same page with each other at all. So I'm not sure that there would have been a British rallying call to save the kind of the holy places, the Byzantine holy places in Constantinople that were falling into Turkish hands at all. That would be my understanding of the situation.
Thank you. And anything else? Any other questions anyone would like to ask? Dr. Professor, I don't know. If you come up, or if you, I can always pass it on. Or maybe just
thanks very much for the lecture. And you mentioned film at one stage. Can I ask for your reaction to the way the Crusades have been portrayed in film? particularly perhaps in the Kingdom of Heaven, which
Yes.
I know influenced a lot of people's perceptions.
Yes, yes. Kingdom of Heaven, I think, is actually a wonderful film. I mean, you know, Ridley Scott is a very good director, and I think it's a really good way in, because it does, I think, give us a very relatable portrait of this count and his journey to the Middle East, and it doesn't shy away from the darkness and messiness and ugliness of warfare and so on. But it's the rose-tinted picture of, for example, the ways in which the kind of encounter between Salah ad-Din and his Crusader counterpart. I'm sorry, I'm slightly foggy on his name at the moment. And so, you know, it's a cinematic depiction of these encounters, which in reality would have been, I would say, probably much more messy, much more fraught. And although I did, you know, talk about the fact that there were extensive diplomatic and trade contacts between these different states, I think it's, when you look at the documentary evidence, underneath the kind of diplomatic language, underneath the kind of niceties, you see a certain amount of tension, a certain amount of one-upmanship. And so the idea that they would be kind of pally with each other is also a little bit kind of disingenuous. Of course, people need a way into these stories and these histories. So I'm not at all against the idea that there being films, but you have to also place each cinematic depiction in its context. What's the context of any particular film? So to draw a contrast with Yusuf Shaheen's film about Saladin, wildly popular, you know, produced in the 60s, wildly popular in the Middle East. That was in the context of Arab nationalism. Ridley Scott's film could be placed in the context of the war on terror. It could be called a critique of war. You know, in that sense, it's, you know, it's playing a useful cultural role. But of course, you have to take these things with a huge pinch of salt, and remember that the Crusades is invoked to answer present day questions and dilemmas as much as it is to tell us about the past based on solid evidence.
Anyone else? Yeah, Adam.
Thanks for the presentation. It was excellent. My question is, in the last few decades, there has been Western intervention in the Middle East, and I'm wondering, do you believe history is repeating itself?
That's a really good question, and the answer is no. I really don't think that we should be looking at the past and seeing these patterns that are much that don't really do justice to the messiness of history, but also the fact that we tend to see history as top, or political developments as top downwards, but actually how people live together and interact with each other often is not along these binary lines. I mean, one of the reasons why the Crusader states became quickly embedded in the kind of political norms of Greater Syria or the Middle East is because people find warfare and conflict to be exhausting. They don't want to be in that crisis mindset all the time. They want to be in a growth mindset. How does that happen? Is that people quickly learn from each other, learn to live with each other, learn to compromise, learn to negotiate. And so the idea that Muslims and Christians have been at war with each other over the centuries is a fallacy. It's an idea that was resurrected with the 19th century context, in the 19th century context of the colonial expansion in the Middle East. But previously, in the early modern period, there are too many instances of kind of mutual cooperation and learnings for me to mention. But there are so many books about this. You know, Diana Dark's written about this, and many other people have written about this. You know, that you have a huge amount of cross-cultural interaction, learning, and so on. So history repeating itself is an idea that I would be very, very wary of. You know, the conditions are always different, and people are not kind of in essence opposed to each other because of religious difference. I really don't think that's the case at all. And it's the same, you could draw an analogy with Sunni Shi'i difference. You know, are Sunnis and Shi'is doomed to be against each other? Well, the answer is no, because you see many centuries of sectarian peace in the same way you see many centuries of interreligious peace as well. I'm not saying conflict should be downplayed, but I'm saying that it should not govern our understanding of how people live together or learn from each other.
Got a question from on Zoom from Ishfaq. We just take that question. You unmute yourself here.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sister Fozia. Thank you very much for the beautiful lecture. I have a question. It's actually got, as you've touched it slightly, that from my wee understanding is that can you just confirm this? Is that the Knights of Templars, from what I can understood after my visit to the Roslin Chaplains, that they actually brought back some Islamic teachings, etc. And what's your view regarding that? And because of that, they were, just went underground with that and not openly presented that to the people of Scotland.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much for your kind words. My understanding is that there was a lot of that happening. I mean, I'm not specifically aware of which texts were brought back, and it's something I'd actually probably should look into a bit more, because I'm sure there are text trails and manuscript trails and so on that one can follow, and perhaps people have done so already. But yes, there was a huge amount of learning from east to west. Now, when I said that the learning was from east to west, it's not to sort of be snooty or to say, well, the West had nothing to offer, but rather it's an acknowledgement of the fact that cosmopolitanism had embedded itself in the Middle East earlier than it had in the Western world. And that's not just my kind of gloss on things, but rather it's something that's kind of widely understood to be the case amongst historians from various different backgrounds. And what this means is that when we think of kind of our architectural landscape, our cultural landscape, there were many things that Christians brought back from the Middle East, not just from Muslims, but also from Jews, from Eastern Christians, and from people from other communities. In other words, kind of cultural norms that were first developed in the East and then came to the West, not least papermaking techniques, which came from China to the Middle East and from the Middle East to the Western world. Some have argued that the church spire is based on the minaret. I mean, I'm giving you a very general answer to a very specific question, so forgive me for that. But I'm just going to say a little bit more about this, just in case it's helpful. We do know that there were developments in the West that did help the Middle East. For example, when the Crusaders, when the kings or the noblemen of the West wanted to send money to the Crusaders in the Middle East, they developed banking techniques to help them do that. So there was some movement of ideas and technologies in both directions. But for the most part, what we see is a great deal of learning, a great deal of cosmopolitanism, and let's say broadening of cultural horizons happening for Westerners who come to the Middle East and bring that learning back with them to the West.
Thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Was it a slip of the tongue when you said Richard was a British king?
Yes, it was a slip of the tongue. Yes, it was. Sorry, he was an English king. Sorry. And I should not be having slips of the tongue when I'm addressing an audience in Scotland, so you have to forgive me for that. You can attribute it to COVID mental fog.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the presentation then. I was wondering if you could comment on some historians' claims that Islam and the Arab world is actually part of what we call the West. And one of the things they will say was that often, for example, when you study like Western history, you'll begin with Babylon and Egypt, and then you'll move over to Europe and the Romans and etc., and you won't go back to Babylon and Egypt. And so the argument is that, well, when you study Western history, you begin by admitting that Western civilization began in the Middle East, and you completely ignore that for the next 100 or so years. So just wondering what you think about that.
Well, yes, there is some truth to that. I mean, I'm not really the person to comment on that too much because it kind of takes me out of my kind of, let's say, my the kinds of things I write about. But that is widely understood to be the case, that what we call the so-called Dark Ages were not the Dark Ages through the Middle East, and we omit that history at our own peril, really. But I think it's one of the things that I hope came out in the lecture, which I think is a general point, is that intellectual discovery is always a shared enterprise, and one of the really wonderful things about studying the history of the Islamic world has been learning about the depth of curiosity and kind of intellectual exploration and the amount of investment that went into learning from traditions outside of one's own tradition, including religious traditions, including medical traditions, legal traditions, learning other languages. And so what you're describing is a kind of a sort of a Western history which moves from, you know, Babylon to the West and omits so much, is a really jaundiced view. And I think we now see that being, you know, kind of really widely overturned. There's been many now, I would say, you know, decades of scholarship which shows how scientific discoveries, you know, began in the Mesopotamian region, were very strongly rooted there, and from there all civilization flowed. I mean, I'm being really crude here and really, really broad brush, but I think that kind of that understanding is widely accepted now. That I mean, you could call that, you know, it has its own kind of slant, and one should not be blind to the fact that, you know, developments were happening in other parts of the world which we may not be aware of because they're less well documented in our educational system. So, you know, what's happening in Latin America, what's happening in the so-called Far East and so on, and other parts of the world even more remote than those, remote for us, I mean. So I think that, you know, there's a certain level of ethnocentrism that goes on when you think about the development of societies. But I think there's a lot more work now on countering those ethnocentric tendencies. And so I'm hopeful that, you know, I'm not very hopeful about the English school system because our way of teaching history is incredibly limited, and all the big questions are ignored. So, for example, colonialism is ignored, and it's told in a very disjointed way. But I'm hopeful that, you know, in the future, when we think about history of East or West, or even the kind of the history of the two combined or intertwined, we'll be much more understanding of the kind of ways in which intellectual life was a joint enterprise between people of different languages and religious backgrounds, and that, I think, is the only way to understand how we get to where we are today, and how we can recover the idea of a shared past and hopefully a shared future.
A few more questions, yeah. Because you had those. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. Barakallahu feekum. Very fascinating presentation. Maybe two quick questions. We were talking about jihad, that it changed. That was interesting. I wonder if you can say a little bit more, since most of Islamic expansion happened prior to the Crusades. So how did it change through the Crusades and then after? And then a second question, maybe touching on the last thing. How would you like us to, you know, to actually look at the Crusades, right? Since the military part is the most salient one, there's this kind of first mover perception. How can we change it since it's already, you know, kind of permanent in people's minds?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you. I'm really sorry, I caught your second question really, really well, but the first question, I missed the beginning of it because I had a blip in my connection.
The change of jihad, right?
The jihad. Okay, yeah. Right. Okay, yeah. Okay, so Kenneth Goody has a wonderful book on changing perceptions of the jihad. It's a relatively recent book, and I recommend you look at it. Kenneth Goody, a Scotsman, and it's Goudie, and you see through the course of this book how the concept of jihad, it didn't arrive fully fledged in the Muslim sphere. It was something that was iterated over time, and it took on different colorings and meanings and significances in response to the nature of, you know, the external threat. And the idea of there being the greater jihad being against the nafs and the lesser jihad being the warfare type of jihad was also something that was rooted in a particular context or contexts. And so it's important to understand the function and role of the idea of jihad, because it's not a catch-all or a kind of a universal concept. It's something which is dynamic, and it's very pragmatic. And I think that pragmatic dimension of jihad is something that's often left because it's often essentialized as a non-changing precept that Muslims subscribe to. That was never the case. It was always something which came into view and faded and was iterated and reiterated, formulated and reformulated in response to changing needs. In the context of the Crusades, it was essential Firstly, for Imad ad-Din, when he began his kind of let's say the first fully fledged attempt to recapture land from the Crusaders. But again, for Salah ad-Din, when he attempted to bring about unity to help in his, let's say, his longer strategy to recapture Muslim territory from Crusaders, formerly Muslim territory from Crusaders. So Goody's book is good for contextualizing some of that story. But those dimensions of jihad being dynamic and pragmatic, I think, are important kind of dimensions for us to keep in mind. Your second question, sorry, remind me of your second question. Forgive me, I'm still in a bit of brain fog.
Second question. Yeah, sorry.
The perception of Crusades, right? It's kind of perpetual because of the first perception that it's about the military, the violent component, and you want us to recast it as kind of the interaction. But how can we go about that, right? It's already.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, now I remember. Yeah, so thank you so much, and I thank you again for repeating the question for me. If you want to learn more, I would suggest that you look into. I mean, Al Jazeera has an interesting 3-part series on the Crusades through Arab and Muslim perspective, which is available on YouTube. Have a look at that. There isn't a go-to source which explores all of the dimensions I've talked about today. Even my work on the Crusades, is limited to a book chapter in which I look at some of the documents preserved by a historian called Ibn al-Furat around the Crusades, which is quite revealing. But in that, you see that Muslim historians never really took the Crusades as seriously as did Latin writers as a phenomenon, because they had, in a sense, a larger existential threats to deal with, the Mongols being one of them. So I think for modern day Muslims or people in general, if you want to read about the Crusades, I think that the problem we have is that some of the scholarly literature is a little bit inaccessible and not very readable or kind of reader friendly. But there are some really good books. I think Carol Hillenbrand, who's was based for many years and is still at the University of Edinburgh as a professor emerita. Her book, Islamic Perspectives on the Crusades, is a really good book for capturing some of the Muslim accounts of the Crusades. I think that part of the learning is unlearning, is to resist some of these popular, the gaming scene, for example, will posit the Crusades as this kind of civilizational battle. I think in our own minds, we have to really resist the idea that there is these civilizational battles. The Huntington thesis that Muslims and Christians are destined to be at odds with each other. Well, I'm sorry, but that's complete nonsense. So part of it is unlearning, part of it is accessing resources of the kind I've just mentioned, and keeping an eye out for some of the kind of, let's say, the biases of the material that does come to us through various sources on the Crusades. Yeah, in various contexts.
Perhaps Adam, say the last question, maybe.
Salah ad-Din was an important political leader and also a military leader. Did he have a massive role as a religious leader as well?
Well, he isn't really a religious leader in the sense that he was guided by ulama, so it depends what you call a religious leader. He was a sultan, and a sultan is not a khalifa. So you get into the kind of realm of Islamic political theory if you ask yourself, is he a religious leader? Because it begs the question, is any sultan a religious leader? And the answer is that no, they're not. So a sultana by its nature is it may be religiously inspired, but it's worldly leadership. Salah ad-Din, by all accounts, became a very pious person. There are conflicting stories of whether he was that pious when he began his life, as a young man. But we do know that he was unworldly. We do know that he did not amass wealth for himself. We know that he set up a system of rule that was a form of power sharing, the appanage system of the Ayyubid family. He was not an egotistical person, from what we can tell. We know that he embodied just warfare, as I've described in the lecture. So he's an exemplar, but not a religious leader in the conventional sense. And even the title of Khalifa, which of course he didn't espouse and was not really a thing by his time, in the sense in which we might have understood it from the Abbasid era or before. Even the Khalifa was a contested category. In the Sunni tradition, only the first 4 were regarded in the Sunni tradition as rightly guided, and the rest, and maybe the fifth Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, but the Khalifas themselves were regarded as in some ways morally compromised. So the idea of Salah ad-Din being a religious leader, I think, is something we should be skeptical of. But he was nevertheless an exemplar in many ways, and he's held up rightly for the good things that he did, both in the Crusades context and more generally.
Maybe I could just ask one last question. You mentioned Baybars as being, perhaps in some ways more important, perhaps, but was he more brutal and more kind of less sort of principled than Salah ad-Din historically? Is that correct?
Yes. It's a really good question, Sheikh Amin. Baybars had a really long military career, and he was considered to be, yes, more brutal, because he was operating in the Mamluk sphere, and the Mamluk sphere was by its nature, the Mamluk system came into being through a regicide. In other words, you have to kill the leader to become the leader, and so in that sense, Baybars' context is a less principled context. Yes, he was clever because he knew when to use diplomacy and when to use warfare. He obviously was incredibly brave and incredibly bold in the way he was able to repel the Mongols at Ain Jalut, and the way in which he then tackled the Crusaders in his lifetime. And he was Sultan for 17 years, so he had a long stint as in the so-called hot seat. So I don't think anyone stands up to Salah ad-Din's standard of just warfare, at least as far as we know. So the answer is that yes, he was successful, but no, but yes, also he wasn't as principled as Salah ad-Din, and for that reason, he's not, let's say, valorized in the same way. Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah. That's brilliant. So I think that brings us to the end. Very, very enjoyable and informative. And thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we all learned things that we didn't know about this really important, stage in history. We're sorry you're not with us physically, but we've got the benefit. Alhamdulillah.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure and an honor, and I appreciate all the conversation and the questions, and also your company. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
It makes us puts ideas and things we might want to research ourselves and look into ourselves and reassess. So Allah bless you for your time and your efforts, and hope to meet physically, inshallah, before too long.
Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Yeah.